So with The Last of Us Part 2 being released this year, I figured now would be a great time to take a look back over the series and to give my overall thoughts on each game in the franchise. Despite the fact that I've talked about it very little on my channel, The Last of Us remains one of my favourite games of all time, and I'm very much looking forward to covering it in this video. Left Behind is also one of the single best pieces of downloadable content I've ever experienced. And as for The Last of Us Part 2, well, we'll get to that. This retrospective will be a two-part series, with Part 1 covering the original game, and Part 2 covering Left Behind and The Last of Us Part 2. So with that, let's take a look back at the series that redefined storytelling in video games. This is The Last of Us, a retrospective. The Last of Us is a third-person, action-adventure, survival horror game, developed by Naughty Dog and released in 2013 for the PlayStation 3. A remastered version of the game, offering higher resolution and frame rate options, would also be ported to the PS4 the following year. The Last of Us was first announced at the Spike Video Game Awards back in 2011. At the time, there was some uncertainty about whether or not it was a good idea for Naughty Dog to start creating video games intended solely for adult audiences. After all, Naughty Dog had built their name from creating family-friendly platformers and light-hearted action-adventure games. So to see them go from this to an M-rated survival horror game left more than a few people feeling slightly apprehensive about the finished product. Thankfully, however, those fears were unfounded, as The Last of Us released to near universal critical acclaim. Critics were in awe of the game's plot, characters, gameplay, and visuals. Even today, it's surprising just how good The Last of Us looks, especially given the hardware that Naughty Dog had to work with. If there's an overall better looking game on the PlayStation 3, I haven't seen it. However, while The Last of Us would go on to become one of the best reviewed games of the entire generation, that does not mean that the game was perfect. The Last of Us ran very poorly on the PS3, which, given the visuals on display, was somewhat understandable, I guess. Despite any minor complaints some critics may have had, however, The Last of Us won the hearts of gamers the world over. People fell in love with Joel and Ellie and the way their relationship evolved over the course of the game. The game's ending also received a huge amount of praise, with many people claiming it to be one of the greatest endings to any video game ever. I would also share that sentiment. The ending was perfect in my opinion. I'm so glad another game didn't come along to fuck it all up. The Last of Us also received an obscene amount of Game of the Year awards, which is crazy when you realise that Grand Theft Auto 5 and BioShock Infinite were also released the same year. But I guess in hindsight, Infinite was pretty disappointing, and for as much as I enjoyed Grand Theft Auto 5, it was just another GTA at the end of the day. The Last of Us, on the other hand, felt like something different entirely. The game's writing and characterization was on a whole other level to anything I had ever experienced in a game before, and once I had completed the game, I kept thinking about it for months afterwards. It's very rare for something to stay stuck in my head for that long. Well, unless it's a comment that someone has left on one of my videos, of course. Excellent video, my friend. The only issue is your voice. Try to more punts. No like a garbage YouTuber, but more to follow what you are telling. Well, like, What the fuck do you want me to do about that? This is how I sound, so unless I'm able to find someone else to narrate my videos, you're just going to have to get used to it.
I'll do it.
You'll do what?
I'll narrate your videos.
I don't know, man. I don't think you have the right voice.
I can do it. I'll sound much fucking better than you anyways.
Fair enough.
For this video, I'll be playing the remastered version.
Okay, I'm sorry, but you're not cut out for this. Your voice is far too robotic.
Get the fuck away from me, retard. I know what I'm doing.
So for this review, I will be playing the remastered version of the game that was released for the PS4 in 2014. This version of the game includes 4K support for the PS4 Pro, as well as an option to run the game at 60 FPS. If you are going to play The Last of Us today, this is the way to do it. Anyways, with all that out of the way, let's begin this review. The Last of Us begins with a young man named Joel returning home late at night. He's talking to a man named Tommy about a potential job that he really needs. He hangs up and sits on the couch beside his daughter, exhausted. His daughter wakes up and gives Joel a gift for his birthday. Right off the bat, the dialogue between these two is charming and, more importantly, believable.
You kept complaining about your broken watch. So I figured, you know. You like it?
Honey, it's
What?
nice, but I think it's stuck. It's not.
What? No. Oh, ha ha.
Where did you get the money for this?
Drugs. I sell hardcore drugs.
Oh, good. You started helping out with the mortgage then.
Yeah, you wish.
The writing in The Last of Us is so phenomenal that even in this short 2-minute interaction, you can instantly tell that these two have a deep love for each other. It reminded me of my childhood when I had a dad. I mean, I still have a dad, I just don't speak to him anymore. Joel puts Sarah to bed and lets her sleep. A few hours later, Sarah wakes up to the sound of a cell phone ringing. It's Joel's brother Tommy. He needs to speak with Sarah's father, but the call is cut short before she has a chance to reply. She searches for her father and sees a nearby building explode. Walking downstairs, Sarah notices several police cars drive past her house. Clearly something massive has just happened within the city, and the fact that Joel is nowhere to be found causes Sarah to start panicking. Eventually, Sarah does find her father, but he seems frightened and even a little shaken. He searches for his gun while claiming that the neighbours have begun acting strangely. It doesn't take long for Sarah to see what Joel was talking about.
I'm kind of sick.
Jimmy!
Dad?
Honey, come here. Come here. Jimmy! Jimmy, I am warning you! Don't!
Obviously, neighbours aren't supposed to behave like this, unless they are accusing you of kidnapping their daughter, of course. Not that I would know anything about that. Joel and Sarah head outside, where Tommy is waiting to take them out of the city. Unfortunately, everyone else in the area also thought it would be a good idea to get the fuck out of the city as soon as possible, and so Joel, Tommy, and Sarah find themselves stuck in a massive traffic jam while flesh-eating zombies roam the streets around them. Tommy drives around looking for another way out of the city when they are hit by a truck. Joel and Sarah escape the wreckage of Tommy's vehicle, but unfortunately Sarah is injured in the accident and can't walk. So now Joel has to carry Sarah while also trying to find a way out of the city, and on top of that, he has to avoid the gosh darn zombies that are spewing out of everywhere. This guy has had better Mondays, am I right? The level of carnage that is currently taking place in the city perhaps feels a little exaggerated. Gas stations are blowing up, buildings are on fire everywhere you look, people are running for their lives while the infected chase after them. It's very impressive from a technical standpoint, especially when you remember that all of this was originally running on a PS3 at a silky smooth 22 frames per second. Eventually, Joel and Sarah make it to the outskirts of the city, where they are stopped by a soldier. The soldier contacts his superior by radio, and is seemingly told to kill Joel and Sarah right there and then. The soldier opens fire on Joel and Sarah. Joel avoids most of the gunfire, which I don't really understand to be honest, but unfortunately Sarah has been shot in her stomach. Joel tries to stop the bleeding, but Sarah dies a few moments later. It's an incredibly powerful moment, and one of the few times a video game has ever made me cry. Even though I've replayed this game almost a dozen times at this point, this scene always causes a strong reaction in me. That should give you some kind of idea of just how good the writing is in The Last of Us. I only knew Sarah for 15 minutes, yet that was all the time the writers needed to cause me to shed tears over her death. For comparison, the only time a movie has ever been able to make me cry in a similar amount of time was during the opening sequence for Up, when I realised I had purchased such a gay-ass film. Anyways, after the opening credits, the game cuts to 20 years later. We see a much older and tired looking Joel suddenly wake up, as if he was just having a nightmare. I personally believe that the opening sequence to this game is what Joel was dreaming about, and we were just reliving his reoccurring nightmare. Joel hears a knock on the door. He answers it and a woman named Tess enters, looking slightly bruised and injured. Tess is Joel's partner, and they work together as smugglers. Since the world has gone to shit and is full of infected, most of the survivors who remain are forced to live in quarantine zones. People who live in quarantine zones are heavily monitored and are also frequently checked for any signs of infection. Since there is no current cure for this plague, if an infected person is found within the quarantine zone, they are eliminated immediately. Because everything that enters and leaves these quarantine zones is so heavily monitored, smugglers exist to sneak supplies and weapons in and out of the city. Joel is annoyed with Tess for attempting to complete a job without him.
District. Hey, we had a drop to make.
We had a drop to make.
Well, you wanted to be left alone, remember?
This line makes me believe that today is actually the 20th anniversary of Sarah's death. I mean, why else would Joel want to be left alone for the entire day? It would also explain the nightmare he was obviously having. Anyways, Tess and Joel head out to find a man named Robert. Robert has stolen some of their weapons, and they need them back. So this is where The Last of Us truly begins, in my opinion. Thankfully, however, you are not thrown straight in at the deep end. The game starts off slow, which gives the player time to become accustomed to controlling Joel. Unlike in most video games, Joel isn't a young, agile superhero. He's an old man, and as a result, some players may be surprised at just how slow and awkward controlling him can feel at times. For example, when you press the run button, Joel doesn't automatically start sprinting like every other video game protagonist. Instead, he starts into more of a leisurely jog. Joel can't jump long distances, nor can he move heavy objects without assistance, and he also isn't some unstoppable killing machine. He's just an old man. Naughty Dog could have taken the easy route and gone with a young, strapping Nathan Drake lookalike for their protagonist, but they instead chose to make Joel a man in his early to mid-50s, and that deserves respect. Anyways, you'll spend the next half hour of the game being taught the different mechanics in The Last of Us. You'll learn how to quick turn, heal yourself with medkits, and how to carry planks. You'll want to remember that last one for later. You'll be carrying a lot of fucking planks and ladders throughout the game. I really enjoyed this quiet time with Tess at the beginning of the game. The world in The Last of Us is so visually striking that even walking around solving very rudimentary ladder puzzles carried a lot of enjoyment for me. Joel and Tess also have great chemistry, and while it's never outright said that these two are romantically involved, it would not be too much of a stretch to imagine that being the case. Eventually, while exploring a building, the player will stumble across their first group of infected. These guys are known as runners, and they are the weakest group of infected you'll encounter in the game. They aren't especially difficult to take out, but it is occasionally possible to sneak past them if you want to conserve ammo and supplies. Thankfully, there is an invaluable mechanic that helps make stealth more of a viable option in the game: listen mode. Because most people don't have a top-of-the-line surround sound system, it can be difficult to tell where your enemies are at times. That's where listen mode comes into play. By holding the R1 button, the player can essentially see any threats around them, which makes taking out your foes without being spotted far easier. While I do understand the need for such a mechanic in a game where stealth is such a vital part of the gameplay, I personally never use it when playing the main campaign anymore. It's just far too overpowered. I like the idea of being able to use sound to detect danger around you, but the problem is that listen mode will always show all nearby threats, even when those threats are not making a sound. So while I do think listen mode is a useful mechanic for many first time players, I also think the game becomes far more tense and rewarding when it's turned off. If you are spotted by the runners, you will either have to kill them or try to outrun them. Honestly, this first combat encounter had me worried that the rest of the game was going to be a simplistic button masher. It's entirely possible to get through most early encounters with the infected by simply mashing the square button over and over again until everyone is dead. I mean, sure, it looks cool when Joel smashes a runner's head off a wall so aggressively that it explodes, but I was hoping for the game's combat system to be a little more involved than this. Thankfully, however, things pick up significantly later on. While The Last of Us is unquestionably an action-adventure game at its heart, the player is mercifully given a lot of breathing room between combat encounters. Instead of being flung from one fight to the next like in most action titles, the player is instead given time to catch their breath, search for supplies, and maybe solve a simplistic puzzle or two. It's simply brilliant game design. Naughty Dog knew that making the player engage in combat constantly would lead to the game feeling incredibly repetitive after just a few hours, so having all these little momentary distractions between fights really helped the game's pacing immensely. Take the game's crafting system for example. It's one of the game's most enjoyable elements, but it's a rather simplistic mechanic when you really stop to think about it. To craft something, you need supplies. So you run your face along the game's environments until the triangle button appears. You pick up everything in sight and voila, you now have enough materials to craft an item. You choose the item you want to craft, hold the X button for a few seconds, and the item appears in your inventory. It's that simple. However, just because crafting is simplistic doesn't mean that there isn't important decisions for the player to make during the crafting process. For one thing, the resources used for crafting items in this world are very scarce, so you need to make your supplies count. If you choose to craft a Molotov cocktail instead of a medkit, for example, that decision might come back to bite you in the ass later if you are running low on health and have no healing supplies remaining. Resource management is a key part of any great survival horror game, and it seems that Naughty Dog really understood this when developing The Last of Us. Anyways, Joel and Tess continue their search for Robert, which eventually leads them to come face to face with a group of Robert's men. We get to see what a fucking badass Tess is.
Let's go, unless you turn around and get your dumb ass out of here.
Fuck this.
Before we're thrown into our first fight against human enemies. While a lot of people have come to define The Last of Us as a survival horror game, that does not mean that the entire game is spent fighting against brain-dead zombies. In fact, in most cases, the human foes you come up against are far more of a threat than any infected the game can throw at you. However, just like the first infected fight in the game, this shootout had me worried that every combat encounter with human enemies would play out like a poor man's Gears of War. I've seen several other people complain about this combat sequence, but in hindsight, I'm not sure I would have designed this fight any differently if I was in such a position to do so. This fight is designed to get players used to the game's cover system and shooting mechanics, and it does exactly that. Practically every combat encounter from here on out is a massive improvement in comparison. Anyways, after spending another half hour snapping the necks of everyone around them, Joel and Tess finally find Robert. This cutscene is a good demonstration of how brutal and cruel Joel and Tess can be at times.
God damn it! Look, alright, just hear me out on this. I got just give me a couple. Come on. Yeah, fuck those fireflies. Just go get them.
That is a stupid idea.
Even though Robert was probably a piece of shit, it's still strangely uncomfortable to watch the quote-unquote heroes of this story gun down this guy in cold blood. But I guess that's the world Joel and Tess live in now. You need to be merciless in order to survive. A woman named Marlene then appears from around the corner. She seems distraught to see Robert dead, claiming that she needed him alive. Marlene is a member of the Fireflies. The Fireflies are a militia group who are seeking freedom from the military oppression that has become prevalent in quarantine zones across America. Their main goal, however, is to find a vaccine for the cordyceps brain infection, which is what's causing everyday normal people to suddenly turn into shambling zombies. Unlike in practically every other zombie story ever told, it's not a virus or secret experiments taking place in an underground laboratory that are to blame for the undead roaming the streets. Instead, the cordyceps in The Last of Us are actually based on something that exists in the real world. Fortunately, the cordyceps in our world can currently only infect ants and other small insects, but the idea behind The Last of Us is that the cordyceps has somehow evolved to also be able to infect humans. I love that idea. It's such a fantastic and grounded way to explain zombies existing in your post-apocalyptic game world. Before Robert had undergone his face reconstruction surgery, he had sold Joel and Tess's weapons to Marlene without their permission, and now they want those weapons back. However, Marlene has other plans. She promises to return the weapons and give them more guns on top of that, but in return she wants them to smuggle something out of the city for her. Joel wants to see what exactly they're being asked to smuggle before he agrees to anything, and so Marlene leads them to a small abandoned building where she can show them what exactly they're smuggling.
Whoa. Come on now. Get on up.
Fuck away from her!
Hey! Let her go.
This is Ellie, and Marlene wants to make sure that she is smuggled safely out of the quarantine zone. Joel is not on board with the idea of smuggling a kid out of the city, probably because the last time he was tasked with protecting a young girl, it kinda blew up in his face. Sorry, too soon. Marlene brings Tess to see the weapons she promised them, while Joel and Ellie make their way towards a nearby hideout. Okay, so you remember your lines, right? Okay, so in 3, 2, 1. Joel and Ellie's relationship doesn't get off to the best start. You can tell that. Okay, that's great, thank you. I'll be in touch. Jesus Christ. Joel and Ellie's relationship doesn't exactly get off to the best start. You can tell that neither of them are actually fond of the idea of having to spend time together.
So instead of just staying in school, you decide to run up and join the Fireflies, is that it?
Look, I'm not supposed to tell you why you're smuggling me, if that's what you're getting at.
You wanna know the best thing about my job? I don't gotta know why. To be honest with you, I give two shits what you're up to.
Well, great.
Good.
To be honest, I was initially skeptical about whether or not Ellie would ever be able to win me over as a character. I mean, I hate escort missions in video games at the best of times, and The Last of Us seemed like it was going to be one long-ass escort mission for its entire 15-hour runtime. Also, I find most teenagers deeply unpleasant to be around, regardless of what my previous criminal record might tell you. So the idea of having to spend so much time with one in The Last of Us filled me with quite a lot of dread. Anyways, Joel and Ellie reach the hideout and decide to rest until Tess arrives. Ellie notices Joel's watch which is the same watch that Sarah gave him 20 years ago. Despite the fact that the watch clearly no longer works, he continues to wear it, almost as a way to honor the memory of his daughter.
I recycle my own semen because, yes, I do masturbate. I'm not ashamed to admit it. As a lot of guys, I'm sure, have done the same thing in their time. Anyway, basically, into the cup, and, I recycle it. So that way, I won't lose any unborn children.
Joel awakens from a bad dream to see Ellie marveling at the view outside. Tess shows up, tells Joel that she has seen Marlene's armory and is satisfied with what she has to offer in exchange for smuggling the kid, and then the three of them set off towards the outskirts of the city. They don't even make it 100 feet outside the city before they are apprehended by Fedra guards. These guys exist to maintain order within the quarantine zones, and also to make sure that no infected people make it in or out of the city. They start scanning Joel, Tess and Ellie to make sure they are not infected when this happens.
Oh, shit. Look.
Jesus Christ. Marlene set us up? Why the hell are we smuggling an infected girl?
So it turns out that Marlene wasn't being totally upfront with Joel or Tess when she asked them to smuggle Ellie outside of the city, as they weren't informed that Ellie was infected before they agreed to do the job. Ellie claims that she was bitten 3 weeks ago and is apparently immune to the effects of the cordyceps, but Joel and Tess understandably aren't buying it. However, before they have a chance to decide what to do next, more Fedra guards arrive, forcing them to make a run for it. What follows is an extended stealth sequence where you are forced to avoid engaging the enemy, as doing so will see you being gunned down almost instantly. So at this point you are probably wondering how the fuck stealth is supposed to work in The Last of Us, when you have 2 other characters following right behind you. Well, Naughty Dog solved this problem by essentially making Tess and Ellie invisible to enemy guards and infected. While this was probably the better choice to make in the end, it does frequently break immersion when Ellie runs out in front of a guard and they don't even notice her. It also makes you wonder why Ellie needs Joel and Tess at all, as she is obviously far more capable of sneaking past these idiots by herself. Anyways, the 3 of them eventually make it to safety and are given some breathing room. They head towards a nearby building, and this is where the game introduces us to the second type of infected we'll be encountering throughout the rest of the campaign, the Clicker. Clickers are basically people who have been infected for a long time. Since the cordyceps has grown all over their head, they are essentially blind, and so need to rely on sound in order to locate their prey. This means that when you encounter a clicker, you need to remain as quiet as possible, and only move when it is safe to do so. You can distract the clicker by throwing a bottle or brick, which will also draw them to the location the object landed in. This means that it is frequently possible to avoid combat with clickers altogether, which is very useful for when you want to save your scarce ammunition for later. Clickers are one of my favourite enemy types in the game, as you are offered a variety of different approaches as to how to take them on. It is also not possible to melee a clicker with your fists, so any complaints I made about the combat being too simplistic go right out the window once these guys are introduced. It can also be terrifying when one does spot you, because if they grab you, it's an instant death. Soon after getting past the clickers, Joel finds a revolver, and this is where the idea of gun holsters come into play. You see, at the beginning of the game, Joel can only have one handgun equipped at any time, So in order to change weapons, he needs to manually reach inside his backpack and change one gun out for the other. The problem is that the game does not pause while Joel is doing this. So if you are in the middle of a gunfight and have to swap one weapon out for another because you've run out of ammo, it can be incredibly intense, which really adds to the survival aspect of the gameplay. Later in the game, you'll find workbenches where you can modify your guns using scrap you find in the game world. More importantly, however, you can also add gun holsters, which allow you to swap weapons on the fly, which is incredibly useful. The further Joel, Tess and Ellie proceed through the city, the more infected they begin to encounter. To keep the player on their toes, clickers also start appearing with other types of infected, like runners. These later fights completely mix up the combat in a meaningful way, as tactics that might work on a runner won't work on a clicker. It keeps the player thinking during these combat encounters, which is a very good thing. Anyways, after a long night of fighting for their lives, Joel, Ellie and Tess finally arrive at the drop-off point, and it seems like everything is going to be okay. Joel and Tess are about to hand Ellie off to a group of fireflies who will take her the rest of the way. And before I continue, can I once again bring up how fucking incredible this game looks for a PS3 title. Even playing the game on a PS4 Pro, I often forgot that I was playing a last generation game. Naughty Dog really knew how to squeeze every last drop of power out of the PS3. Upon reaching the drop-off point, Joel and Tess unfortunately find everyone dead inside. This essentially means that they will now need to bring Ellie the rest of the way themselves. However, there's currently a much bigger issue that needs to be addressed.
Now, we tried. Let's just go home.
I'm not going anywhere. This is my last stop.
What?
Our luck had to run out sooner or later.
You going on?
No, don't! Don't touch me.
Holy shit. She's infected.
Joel,
Let me see.
I didn't mean for this.
Show it to me. Oh, Christ.
Oops, right?
There is so much subtle storytelling going on in this scene that a lot of people might miss during their first playthrough. For instance, during the first few hours of the game, we are given the impression that Joel and Tess really like each other, and that maybe their relationship extends past simply being work partners.
After we get back, we can take it easy for a little while.
You want to take it easy.
Hey, you're the one always going on about laying low.
And you always brush me off.
Well, you won't this time.
I believe it when I see it.
However, it's also very obvious that Joel is a lot more emotionally distant than Tess is, almost like he's afraid to get too attached to this woman, probably because of his tragic past. But the moment Tess reveals the bite, Joel very briefly lets his guard down. You can tell he's genuinely shocked and maybe even a little heartbroken, because this woman who he genuinely cares about is going to turn into an infected. But almost immediately afterwards, he composes himself, and the cold, distant Joel returns.
Ellie,
I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this.
get a move on.
After all, Joel is used to seeing people he cares about dying, so why should he show any emotion over it anymore? I was sad to see Tess die so early in the game. She was a genuinely great character and a total badass. I get the feeling that at one point Joel was supposed to die here so that Tess would become Ellie's sole protector, which would have also probably made for an interesting story. As it is, however, Joel is the one who survives, and now he needs to lead Ellie to safety. They escape the building and hide in an old subway tunnel, and this is where two important details about Ellie are revealed. One is that she can safely breathe in cordyceps spores without dying, which means that she really is immune.
How the hell are you breathing in this stuff?
I wasn't lying to you.
The second is that she can't swim. Don't worry about that though, because these fucking pallets seem to always appear just when our heroes need them. You better get used to using these things to guide Ellie across water, by the way. You're going to be doing it a fucking lot. Upon escaping the area, Joel realizes that if he's to have any hope of delivering Ellie safely to the Fireflies, he's going to need a car. So he decides to track down an old friend of his called Bill. Bill lives in an old abandoned town that has become overrun with infected. I like this chapter a lot, as it's here that we really see Joel and Ellie's relationship start to develop. There is also a lot of beautiful scenery in this chapter, and did I mention this is a fucking PS3 game? I think I did. We get to see how Joel and Ellie really are complete polar opposites of each other. For example, Ellie greets everything with excitement and a sense of wonder.
Whoa, look. Fireflies. I mean, real fireflies.
Yeah, I see that.
Joel, on the other hand, has a much more pessimistic and negative view of the world.
Do you think they ever found each other?
How the hell would I know?
Well, I'd like to think they did.
It was during this chapter that I really began to warm towards Ellie. Up until this point, the game had been relentlessly bleak, but Ellie's childlike wonder and goofy sense of humour really brings a sense of lightheartedness to the game that was sorely needed. Anyways, Joel and Ellie continue to explore the town, encountering a few deadly traps along the way.
Jesus!
So it turns out that Bill has basically booby-trapped the entire town, which means the player has to be extra careful while navigating through the area. Joel eventually stumbles across a bow and arrow, which is actually one of my favourite weapons in the game, as it allows you to kill enemies from a distance without breaking stealth. Ellie begs Joel to give her the bow and arrow, claiming that she knows how to use the thing, and that she could back him up if only he would give her a weapon. However, Joel isn't hearing any of it. Soon afterwards, however, Joel is caught in one of Bill's rope traps, and the noise this causes alerts many nearby infected to their position. Bet you wish you gave Ellie a gun now, don't you, Joel? This sequence is one of my favourites in the game, as it's one of the first times that Joel and Ellie actually have to work together as a team. The change in perspective can also make aiming your weapons feel disorienting at first, and it's even possible for Ellie to die here, which adds to the stakes considerably. Eventually, Ellie manages to cut Joel down, just in time for Bill to show up and save his life.
You're off your ass on your feet.
The three of them flee towards a nearby safe house, and it's here that Bill introduces himself.
Thanks for the heroics and all. Ellie. Hey, what are you... Joel?
Bill!
What are you doing?
Bill!
Let me go.
Turn around and get on your knees.
Just calm down a second.
Turn around
All right.
and get on your knees. Don't test me.
It seems that all the time spent living alone in an abandoned town has started to affect Bill's mental state of mind, as he is visibly paranoid and apprehensive around other humans. He checks Joel for any bites, but thankfully before he has a chance to check Ellie, she escapes and starts attacking him. I love this scene because it aptly demonstrates how strong and capable Ellie is, even at such a young age. She doesn't take any shit. I also love what a smartass she can be at times.
Yeah, sure, Joel. Go ahead. Take my card. Take all my food, too, while you're at it.
By the looks of it, you could lose some of that food.
Listen to me, you little shit.
No, fuck you! You handcuffed me!
I need you to shut up.
Oh, goddamn town's booby-trapped. Best stay right on my ass.
Can't miss it.
Knock it off.
Ellie was really starting to grow on me at this point, and I think the constant bickering between her and Bill played some role in that. The next hour or so is spent exploring the town with Bill. There is a car battery in a nearby school, and if they are able to retrieve it, there would be no problem getting a nearby car up and running again. The only problem is that there's a whole lot of infected between them and the school. Thankfully, however, Joel has a few new weapons to make traversing Bill's town a bit more manageable, namely the shotgun. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the shotgun in The Last of Us is one of the most satisfying weapons I've ever used in a video game. It just fucking destroys enemies, sending several of their limbs flying in the process. It's a weapon I never tire of using. So after fighting through dozens of infected, Joel, Bill and Ellie finally make it to the school. Unfortunately, the car battery has already been taken, so the three of them need to find an exit fast, as infected are swarming them from all directions. Just before they're able to escape, however, they are stopped in their tracks by a bloater.
That don't sound good.
Bloaters are the deadliest of infected you'll come across in the game. You can forget about sneaking up on these guys to stealth kill them. You can also forget about using any melee weapons against them. Firearms are the only way to take these guys down, so if you run out of ammo fighting these guys, well, you're fucked. The bloaters serve as a pretty big difficulty spike whenever they appear, but thankfully they only show up a handful of times throughout the game. Eventually, Joel takes down the bloater and the three of them escape the school through a nearby window. They take shelter in a nearby house when Bill sees a familiar face.
Jesus. What, you know this guy or something?
Frank.
Who the hell's Frank?
He was my partner. He's the only idiot that would wear a shirt like that.
So this guy was Bill's partner, Frank, and during my first playthrough, I was too naive to realise what Bill meant by partner. So as it turns out, Bill is gay, and that was very surprising to me because he doesn't come across as your stereotypical gay character. He's gruff, violent, and has a short temper. He also swears like a sailor. But this game made me realise that I had several misconceptions about what a gay person should be. Before I had played The Last of Us, I assumed that all gay men were naturally camp and that they all had amazing fashion sense. And I was wrong and maybe even a little close-minded to be thinking that way. Bill is a really great representation of a gay person because he's the polar opposite to how most gay people have been portrayed in television and film. Anyways, it turns out that Frank stole the car battery himself because he wanted to escape the town. However, he was bitten before he had a chance to do so. So now Joel and Ellie have a way to escape the area. But first they need to start the damn truck. What follows is a set piece where Joel and Bill push the truck while Ellie tries to start the engine. However, all the noise this creates inevitably draws nearby infected. So not only does the player have to worry about pushing the truck, but they also need to watch out for any infected creeping up on them. It's a great sequence and the perfect end to one of the best chapters in the game. Eventually, Ellie manages to get the engine running and the three of them escape the area. Joel says his goodbyes to Bill before hitting the road with Ellie. This next scene is where I really started to just completely fall in love with both Joel and Ellie as characters. That's mostly thanks to Ellie being fucking hilarious in this scene.
Oh, I'm sure your friend will be missing this tonight. It's light on the reading, but it's got some interesting photos.
Now, Ellie, that ain't for kids.
Whoa! How the hell would he even walk around with that thing?
Get rid of that.
Well, hold your horses. I want to see what all the fuss is about. Oh, why are these all stuck together? I'm just fucking with you.
Bill is so silly. He stuck his magazine together with glue. You can really see Joel start to warm towards Ellie during this scene. His tough guy exterior starts to soften. He even cracks a smile or two. He doesn't want to get too attached to Ellie, but he can't help it. He wants to protect her, the same way we want to protect her as the player. It's worth noting that the father-daughter bond that develops between these two is all the more believable thanks to the incredible performances given by Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson, who play the roles of Joel and Ellie respectively. Contrary to popular belief, I don't believe that Troy Baker is the best voice actor working in games today, but he just fucking nails it as Joel. You can tell that Troy studied the character obsessively beforehand, because he delivers every line perfectly. Joel is a broken man who has given up on the world and himself, and Troy seems to understand that better than anyone. However, as good as Troy Baker is as Joel, it's Ashley Johnson who absolutely steals the show as Ellie. Ashley was somehow able to breathe so much life into such a tragic character. When you realise how shit Ellie's life has been up until now, and all the people she has lost, it's quite amazing to see her still be able to crack jokes and have such a positive outlook on life, and none of it would have worked if not for Ashley's emotionally charged performance. So Joel and Ellie finally arrive in Pittsburgh, but unfortunately the roads are completely jammed with the wreckage of cars. Joel decides to take a detour, but soon regrets that decision.
Easy! Holy shit. Are we gonna help him?
Put your seatbelt on, Ellie.
Well, what about the guy?
He ain't even hurt.
Alone and forsaken by fate and by man. Oh Lord, if you hear me, please take my hand.
So how did Joel know it was an ambush? Well, we're not given any time to think about that before Joel and Ellie are pulled from their truck and another fight ensues.
Oh, you chicken shit!
Yeah, so I guess now is as good a time as any to talk about the violence in The Last of Us. As I mentioned earlier, The Last of Us was Naughty Dog's first M-rated title, and there was some uncertainty before release about how far the development team would take the violence in the game. In my opinion, they took it about as far as they needed to, in order to tell the grounded story they wanted to tell. This is a brutal world that Joel and Ellie live in, where one wrong move can mean your death, and this is reflected in the gameplay. Human enemies waste no time in trying to brutally murder you and Ellie if they so much as catch you sniffing around their territory. I've seen some people claim that the game is unnecessarily violent and that it could negatively affect some people, but I couldn't disagree more with that idea. I've played this game nearly a dozen times at this point, and it hasn't even remotely made me a more violent person.
Oh my god!
Just had to be sure he wouldn't get back up. Shortly after the ambush, Ellie asks Joel how he knew that the hunter wasn't really injured, to which Joel replies that he has been on both sides.
How did you know?
Know what?
About the ambush.
I've been on both sides.
We'll take that as a yes.
Take it however you want.
This is an important interaction because it reminds the player that regardless of how attached we've become to Joel by this point, he's still a bad person who has done some truly fucked up stuff throughout his life. I mean, you can see this in how brutally he kills some of his enemies.
Listen,
Take it easy, huh?
Shit. I guess Joel won't stop killing until he becomes the Last of Us. I like that. Good one, Ben. Why are you still here? I mean, don't get me wrong, the violence can still be very effective at times. Seeing a 14-year-old girl stab a man brutally to death is a little fucked up to say the least. It's also slightly disturbing to see Ellie think it's appropriate to whip out a joke book 5 seconds after you've blown some poor cunt's head off.
I walked into my sister's room and tripped on a bra. It was a booby trap.
Trust me, I've told jokes shortly after someone has died before, and it's never a good idea. I just wanted people to stop crying at my grandfather's funeral. He would have wanted everyone to be happy. Anyways, the next few hours are spent in Pittsburgh, and this is one of my favourite sections of the entire game. Not only is the city absolutely stunning to wander through, but it's at this point where the combat really starts to hit its stride. There's a much greater variety of human enemies from this point forward. Some carry melee weapons and will try to rush you to fuck your shit up. Some hunters instead choose to carry Molotov cocktails, which they can use to flush you out of cover. And some even carry high-powered weapons like sniper rifles. This enemy variety keeps combat from ever feeling too repetitive, which is good because there's a lot of fucking combat from here on out. The level design during the Pittsburgh chapter is also top class. These aren't just linear arenas like in any other third-person shooter. The player is given a lot of options on how to tackle these combat encounters. Take the hotel for example. This place is massive, with several rooms to explore, and even multiple routes that lead to the upper floors of the building. It becomes increasingly difficult to stay stealthy during these areas, as enemy numbers increase substantially from here on out. If you are spotted and have to engage the enemy, you have a few options at your disposal. You could throw a brick to stun a guard, and then melee him for a one-hit kill. Or you could instead choose to grab a guy from behind, shoot one of his buddies, and then blow his brains out. Combat has a very improvisational feel to it. You constantly have to adjust your tactics to stop the enemy from getting the upper hand, and it just feels amazing to play at times.
Oh shit!
Holy shit, Joel.
So while making their way through the hotel, Joel and Ellie get separated. This leads to Joel having to navigate through another area filled with infected before he returns to the surface, and this happens.
I shot the hell out of that guy, huh?
Yeah, you sure did.
So Ellie has just killed her first non-infected person, and surprisingly, she doesn't seem too bothered about it. However, instead of thanking her for saving his life, Joel instead scolds Ellie for refusing to stay where she was. I believe the reason he's annoyed with Ellie is because he wants to feel like he can trust her, and the more she wanders off and does her own thing, the more likely she'll end up just like Sarah, and he wouldn't be able to handle something like that happening again. In other words, Joel has begun to develop a parental bond with Ellie, even though he probably wishes that wasn't the case. Shortly afterwards, however, Joel realizes that without Ellie's help, that hunter would have killed him. He begins to realize that he's not a young man anymore, and that without Ellie's help, he simply won't survive this journey. And so this leads to Joel finally trusting Ellie with a weapon. What follows is one of the most difficult combat encounters in the game, but there's a reason for this. Naughty Dog wanted the player to have to rely on Ellie to survive this wave of enemies, and she does an excellent job blowing these dudes away. Maybe too good a job, considering she's never actually fired a proper rifle before. But whatever. Once everyone is dead, Joel hands Ellie a handgun. From here on out, Ellie can back Joel up in a meaningful way during combat, which is good because the game becomes significantly more difficult from here on out. Had to make sure he was dead. I give up. Don't give up, man. Will you please get the fuck out of my apartment? Eventually, a new threat appears in the form of an armoured vehicle fitted with a turret. So now not only do you need to worry about dealing with the hunters, but you also have to constantly take cover from this fucking thing. Joel and Ellie eventually manage to lose the vehicle, but another surprise is waiting for them right around the corner.
Look!
Leave him alone.
These two are Henry and Sam. While it initially seems like they are a threat to Joel and Ellie, it turns out that their end goal is very similar to that of our protagonists. They're just trying to survive and find their way out of the city. The four of them decide to team up because they stand a much greater chance of making it out of the city alive if they work together. Eventually, they reach Henry's safe house and go over their plan of escape.
Check this out. Look at these sons of bitches. Every day they congregate down there, guarding that damn bridge. Come nighttime, it's down to a skeleton crew. After sunset, that's our window. Most of them gone, sneak right past them.
That could work.
Oh, it'll work. It'll definitely work.
Ellie and Sam are seen playing together, laughing and having fun. It's kinda sad when you realise that this is probably the first time these two have been able to be just kids in months.
Tell me why I'm stuck in a sad, lonely cage. Tell me why I so need a cute girl my age. Tell me why I ain't ever wanna hear you say I have a boyfriend.
He says it's time to go.
Anyways, later that night, the four of them begin their escape from the city. However, it doesn't take long for shit to hit the fan once the armoured vehicle from earlier shows up again. Unfortunately, it's here where Henry shows what he's capable of doing in order to keep his little brother safe.
We're good. Sam, let's go. All right, kid, come on. There you go. Hurry, hurry.
Stay locked.
Ready?
Gotcha.
Okay, we gotta get him up.
I'm sorry. We're leaving.
What? What's this bullshit?
Hey, now!
What the fuck, Henry? We stick together.
I love this scene because it shows how attached Ellie has become to Joel by this point in the campaign. She would never abandon him now, even if it meant putting her life on the line. The two of them try to outrun the vehicle, but eventually they reach a dead end when they discover that the bridge they were trying to cross has collapsed. Despite the fact that she can't swim, Ellie decides to jump for it, which leaves Joel no other option than to jump in after her. The two of them are knocked unconscious, but awaken sometime later on the beach nearby. It turns out that Henry saved both Joel and Ellie from drowning, despite previously abandoning them. It shows the kind of tough decisions people have to make in this world. Henry isn't a bad guy. In fact, he seems like one of the few genuinely good people left in this miserable world. But in order to survive and keep his brother safe, he probably had to do some fucked up stuff along the way, whether that be killing other human beings or leaving an ally to die. It's just the way things have to be in this world. Joel eventually calms down and the four of them begin to explore their current surroundings. They find the entrance to a sewer, and this is where things take a really dark turn. Joel finds notes left by a man named Ish littered around the area. Ish had previously decided that the sewers that Joel and company currently find themselves in would function great as a safe house. So he begins bringing supplies, furniture, and whatever else he can find back to the sewers. He also starts looking for other survivors to trade with. Eventually, he meets Kyle and his family, and invites them to his hideout, claiming that they will be safe from the infected there. Even though this is a spoiler review of The Last of Us, I don't want to go in depth about what eventually becomes of Ish and his friends, since it's one of the game's biggest emotional gut punches, and deserves to be experienced firsthand. As to be expected, the sewers are not as safe as they initially seem, with a seemingly endless amount of infected roaming the area. There are a few really cool set-piece moments during this section of the game, including a really intense fight where Joel and Henry have to hold off waves of infected while Ellie and Sam unlock the exit to the sewers. Once outside, Joel and Ellie find themselves in a quaint little neighbourhood and are given a few moments to catch their breath and enjoy the serene beauty of the area. There are a lot of really sweet interactions between Ellie and Sam here that are easy to miss if you rush through the area too quickly.
Let's hear it.
Why can't your nose be 12 inches long?
I don't know, why?
Because then it would be a foot.
That is so dumb. I love it. Fuck!
Horrible.
Alright. It's a tie.
No. You clearly got destroyed.
How did I clearly...
It's kinda heartbreaking seeing Sam enjoying himself and getting to be a kid again, especially once you've already seen what happens next. So once Joel has finished searching the neighbourhood for supplies, the group move towards the nearby radio tower. But before they can get there, they are pinned down by a nearby sniper. Joel tells the group to stay put while he attempts to flank the guy. It's actually a really cool little combat arena, where you are constantly having to move towards the sniper's hideout while dealing with nearby hunters and avoiding the sniper's gunfire. Upon reaching the asshole's little hidey hole, Joel kills him in a most satisfying way. He then lays down cover fire for Ellie and the others using the sniper rifle. Eventually, the tank that has been hounding the player for hours shows up again, and let me tell you, there are very few moments in gaming more satisfying than this. Ellie and the others eventually make it across the street, and the group decide to make a run for it before any more infected show up. This next scene is always difficult for me to watch, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because I have a brother who reminds me a little of Sam, or maybe it's just because this scene itself is so expertly written. Whatever the case, this interaction between Sam and Ellie destroys me every time.
How is it that you're never scared?
Who says that I'm not?
What are you scared of?
Let's see. Scorpions are pretty creepy. Being by myself. I'm scared of ending up alone. What about you?
Those things out there. What if the people are still inside? What if they're trapped in there without any control of their body? Scared of that happening to me.
And second, they might still look like people, but that person is not in there anymore.
Henry says that they've moved on, that they're with their families, like in heaven. Do you think that's true?
I go back and forth. I mean, I'd like to believe it.
But you don't.
I guess not.
Yeah. Me neither.
So it turns out that Sam was bitten a few hours ago without anyone else realizing it. He knows he's going to turn into an infected, and so he turns to Ellie for comfort. He wants her to reassure him that there's an afterlife, that he'll get to see his mother again, and that he won't just turn into another brain-dead zombie. But obviously, since Ellie doesn't realize that Sam's already been bitten, she just speaks honestly and tells him that she doesn't really believe in all that stuff, which obviously isn't what Sam wants to hear. It's kinda fucking heartbreaking when you think about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's obvious that Sam won't be going to heaven when he dies, since he's black, but I still... Oh, come on! I was kidding! Anyways, the next morning Ellie goes to wake Sam for breakfast, but as to be expected, he turned overnight and attacks Ellie on the spot. Henry is forced to kill his brother, and as you might expect, this decision destroys him.
What have you done? I'm gonna get that gun from you, okay? Oh, okay, easy.
This is your fault.
This is nobody's fault, Henry.
It's all your fault.
Henry! Henry, no!
Oh my god.
It's a really sad end for two genuinely likeable characters, and even though it was easy to predict them dying, I still wish they had met a better end than this. The story then jumps forward a few months. It is now autumn. Joel and Ellie are in a mountainous area, close to Tommy's home. The two of them seem to have grown a lot closer during the last few months, since Joel is now a lot more talkative and open about his past with Ellie. He tells her about the last time he ever spoke to his brother, which is something he never would have opened up about back in Pittsburgh.
How was it? The last time you saw him?
I believe his last words to me were, I don't ever want to see your goddamn face again.
But he's gonna help us?
That's what we're gonna find out.
Eventually, the two of them reach Tommy's camp, and despite all the hurtful shit that was said the last time they met, the two brothers greet each other with open arms. Tommy's wife, Marlene, agrees to give Ellie the grand tour of the place, while Joel and his brother go somewhere quiet where they can talk privately. Joel informs Tommy that the girl he brought with him will rid the world of the pandemic currently plaguing humanity, and pleads with his brother to deliver Ellie safely to the Fireflies. Tommy isn't buying it, but tells Joel that even if he was to believe him, he left the Fireflies a long time ago and has no intention of returning to that life. The two of them get into a heated argument before the sound of gunfire forces them to temporarily set their differences aside and work together to rid the plant of the invading hunters. After a long and arduous battle, the plant is safe, and Tommy finally agrees to take Ellie off of Joel's hands. Ellie overhears some of this conversation and flees from the plant on horseback, forcing Joel and Tommy to head off after her. What follows is one of the most breathtakingly beautiful scenes in the entire game, where you ride through a mostly quiet forest, taking in the sights and sounds around you. Eventually, Joel and Tommy find a lone cabin out in the woods, with Ellie's horse tied up outside. Joel enters the house and finds Ellie upstairs, seemingly reading some young girl's diary. She remarks about how ridiculous people's problems were in the past. Worrying about finding a date for the prom, or trying to obtain clothes that suit you, would seem ridiculous to a girl who has grown up in a world where just surviving another day is an accomplishment in and of itself. Ellie is angry with Joel because she believes that he doesn't want anything to do with her anymore, that he's desperate to get rid of her. However, Joel's logic for handing her over to Tommy is that he believes she'll actually be more safe with him. He doesn't trust himself with the task of delivering Ellie safely to the Fireflies. He believes it will all end in a manner similar to 20 years ago. Ellie then takes the conversation in a direction that Joel is clearly not comfortable with.
Not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel. But I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you. So don't tell me that I would be safer with someone else, because the truth is I would just be more scared.
You're right. You're not my daughter. And I sure as hell ain't your dad. And we are going our separate ways.
Of course, Joel doesn't really believe what he's saying. He knows that behind his tough guy facade, there's a broken old man who has begun to love Ellie as if she was his own daughter. He just can't allow himself to become attached to her, because if something was to ever happen to Ellie, it would completely finish him off altogether. Joel and Ellie are just getting ready to leave when some hunters storm the house. After clearing the house, Joel and Ellie begin the long horse ride back to Tommy's. Joel clearly has had time to think during the ride back, because once they arrive at their destination, he has a change of heart and decides to bring Ellie the rest of the way by himself.
What are you doing?
Your wife kind of scares me. I don't want her coming after me.
Sorry for stealing your horse.
Well, come back to town. Let's discuss it at least.
You know me, my mind's all made up.
The Fireflies are apparently stationed at a college campus in Colorado, so that's where they head off to. This next section gives Joel and Ellie an extended period of peace and quiet, where they talk extensively about a wide array of topics. We find out that Ellie always wanted to be an astronaut growing up, while Joel always wanted to be a singer. What's sweet about this interaction is that both Joel and Ellie get to realise these dreams to a certain extent in the sequel. We also discover that Joel never went to college, as he had Sarah at a very young age. This prompts Ellie to bring up Sarah's mother, but Joel refuses to talk about her. What's strange about this interaction is that Joel and Ellie have known each other for about 3 months at this point. Surely Joel's wife would have been brought up at some point during that time, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Regardless, aside from a handful of infected battles, there is very little combat during this section of the game, which feels deliberate. Joel and Ellie have been through the ringer up until this point, so it only seems fair to give them a little peace for once. You do, however, find a flamethrower on the campus, which is always a fun time. Eventually, Joel finds a voice recorder from a dead researcher. The researcher informs whoever is currently listening that the Fireflies have moved their base of operations to a hospital in Salt Lake City. However, before Joel and Ellie can comprehend their next course of action, they are ambushed by hunters. The following combat encounter is one of the most intense in the entire game, with what feels like over a dozen hunters closing in on Joel and Ellie from all directions. Upon trying to escape the area, Joel is suddenly attacked and falls over the railing. Thankfully, he's okay. Oh yeah, apart from that. Joel is now badly injured and in dire need of medical aid, so now it falls to Ellie to safely escort them out of the college. The roles of our two protagonists have been reversed, with Ellie now becoming Joel's protector. We also get to see what a brutal and efficient killer Ellie has become. What's especially noteworthy about this scene, however, is just how fucking good the writing is here. Despite the fact that things are currently looking very bleak for Joel and Ellie, the writers didn't hesitate to add in a little dark humour to lighten the mood a bit.
I swear to God, I get you out of this. You're so singing for me.
You wish.
I wonder what a game that's as bleak as The Last of Us, but without any sense of humour, would look like. Anyways, Ellie successfully gets Joel out of the college, and the two of them ride out of the area. Shortly afterwards, however, Joel falls unconscious, and Ellie is left alone to try and figure out what to do next. As we soon find out in the DLC, however, Ellie is more than capable of taking care of herself and her loved ones without assistance from others by this point in the story. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story then cuts ahead a few months to winter. We see Ellie hunting for food. Worryingly, Joel is nowhere to be seen. Did he die in the intervening months? Well, it's going to be some time before we are given our answer. In the meantime, however, Ellie encounters a deer and decides to put her bow skills to the test. What follows is one of my favourite sections in the game. It's a slow, drawn-out sequence where you carefully sneak up on the deer and try to make every shot count. Depending on your skill level, this hunt can take upwards of 10 minutes. It actually reminded me a bit of the end boss fight from MGS3, which is a very flattering comparison if you've never played that game before. However, setting your PS4 clock forward a week will not cause the deer to die of old age, unfortunately. Eventually, Ellie injures the deer enough to cause it to flee the area. She soon finds it dead nearby, but before she has a chance to claim her prize, she's interrupted by an old man named David and his friend James. David claims that he and the people from his camp are very hungry and that they could really do with some of that deer. Ellie reluctantly agrees to trade some of the deer for medicine, and so James goes off to get some from their camp. In the meantime, Ellie and David take shelter in a nearby cabin. While waiting for James to return, Ellie and David are ambushed from all directions by infected. This next section plays almost like something out of Call of Duty Zombies, where you are forced to hold off waves of infected while keeping the entrances to the cabin closed off. Eventually, however, Ellie and David are forced to make a run for it, and they spend the next several minutes fighting to stay alive against a ridiculous amount of infected. It's a fantastic sequence, and my favourite encounter with the infected in the entire game. After the battle has ended, David and Ellie return to the cabin. While waiting for James to return with the medicine, David remarks on how funny it is that the two of them should meet under such circumstances.
Lucky? No. No such thing as luck. Now, you see, I believe that everything happens for a reason.
Sure.
I do. And I can prove it to you. Now, this winter, that's been especially cruel. A few weeks back, I sent a group of men out to a nearby town to look for food. Only a few came back. They said that the others had been slaughtered by a crazy man. And get this, he's a crazy man traveling with a little girl. You see, everything happens for a reason.
This is such a fantastic scene. David is such a creepy piece of shit who seems to be taking immense pleasure in playing mind games with Ellie. David is played by the incomparable Nolan North, and I can guarantee you that 99% of people playing this game for the first time would never have guessed that it was Nathan Drake's voice actor giving this performance. It's one of Nolan's best performances in my opinion. Anyways, despite the protests from James, David gives Ellie the medicine and allows her to return home unscathed. Of course, this is just a trap because what David really wants to know is where the old man is hiding out. So he sends someone to track her movements. Ellie arrives back at her hideout where it is revealed that Joel is still alive, but he's in a bad state. Ellie treats him as best as she can and then falls asleep. You can really feel the attachment she has to Joel at this point. The two of them have become practically inseparable over the last few months. Ellie awakens the next morning to the sound of David's men searching for her and Joel. Knowing that Joel is in no state to fight, she leads David's men away from the hideout on horseback. Unfortunately, the horse Ellie is riding on is shot, and so she's forced to take cover in a nearby cabin. Hunters start scanning the area for Ellie, but these guys are no problem for her. While attempting to escape the area, however, Ellie is grabbed from behind by David. She awakens sometime later trapped in a tiny cell, and what she witnesses next truly horrifies her. So it turns out that David and his crew are actually cannibals and have been eating any intruders who set foot in their territory. Later that day, David brings her some food, claiming that it's just deer, but Ellie isn't buying it. Still doesn't stop her from eating it though, which is kind of fucked up. Ellie is perplexed as to why David has chosen not to kill and eat her too. However, she is soon given her answer.
Now I think it's your turn. It's the only way I'm going to be able to convince the others.
Convince them of what?
That you can come around. You have heart. You're loyal. And you're special.
Oh.
So it turns out that David is not only a cannibal, he's also a big old fucking pedo. This guy is doing a great job at being the most unlikable cunt on the face of the earth. Ellie's reaction to learning all of this is fucking priceless though.
Ellie.
What?
Tell them that Ellie is the little girl that broke your fucking finger!
God, I love Ellie. Not in the way David loves her, of course, but I still love her. She is such a sassy bitch. David decides that Ellie is next on the chopping block, so unless someone shows up to help her soon, she is in deep shit.
And I look forward to the eventuality of you and me having our sex time together. I'll do my best to pleasure you and keep you satisfied. Miss Biz Ivy, just for you. Just for you. I know a number of good positions and massages.
Joel suddenly awakens and calls out for Ellie. However, she is no longer in the house, and so he sets out to find her, despite the fact that he is still gravely injured. After all, he owes her his life at this point. Joel is jumped by two of David's men, but he is still somehow able to overpower both of them, despite being seriously injured and in his mid-50s. Whatever, don't dwell on it. He interrogates the two men and threatens to kill both of them if they aren't cooperative in pinpointing Ellie's exact location. Eventually, one of the men gives up the location, but Joel kills both of them anyway. He's past playing fair at this point. Cutting back to Ellie, we see her being held down on a table while James prepares to cut her into tiny pieces. It's kinda fucked up. Fortunately, Ellie is a lot smarter than these guys and claims that she's infected before showing her bite marks. This freaks David out just long enough for Ellie to make her escape. Now she needs to find her way out of this fucked up town, but unfortunately a snowstorm makes navigating the area something of a nightmare. Ellie eventually makes it to a diner, but unfortunately David is already waiting for her. Thus begins the game's sole boss fight, and to be honest, it's a pretty great one. To defeat David, Ellie needs to sneak up behind him 3 times and stab him with her pocket knife. This is easier said than done, however. David is much smarter than the regular hunters you've been facing up until now. He will occasionally hide and wait for Ellie to show herself. He also reacts to noise much more aggressively than regular enemies. David is creepy enough as is, but when he runs towards you with a machete, it can be genuinely terrifying. Shortly after delivering the final blow to David, he knocks Ellie unconscious. Looks like it's up to Joel to save the day. Or is it? Joel needs to fight his way through town to reach Ellie in time. He stumbles upon some of the fucked up things these people have been doing, which only strengthens his resolve to find Ellie in time. He makes it to the diner, only to see it in flames. We then cut back to Ellie, who is badly injured. She begins crawling towards her pocket knife, only for David to grab her at the last moment. It looks like this is the end for Ellie, but who knows, maybe Joel will make it in time and... Oh, I guess she didn't need Joel after all. I really like the misdirection portrayed during this sequence. For practically the entire chapter, you are convinced that Joel will be the one to save Ellie, only for the game to subvert expectations at the last minute and demonstrate how little Ellie needs Joel for protection anymore. If anything, the roles have been reversed at this point. Joel needs Ellie a lot more than she needs him, and the ending of this chapter demonstrates that quite clearly. The story then moves forward a couple of months to spring. It's a beautiful day, and both Joel and Ellie seem to be in good spirits. The hospital where the Fireflies are stationed is within view, and it seems like nothing could possibly go wrong from here on out. This is one of the longest periods of gameplay without combat in The Last of Us, and it makes sense. You couldn't go from Ellie nearly being raped to killing infected again within the space of a few minutes. Joel and Ellie, as well as the player, have earned their rest at this point. While exploring the ruins of the city, Joel and Ellie catch a glimpse at something that takes their breath away. At this point, I think the giraffe scene has been hyped up by so many people as being one of the greatest moments in video game history, that many new players will wonder what the big fuss is about upon reaching this scene. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful moment, and serves as a nice change from all the horrific shit Joel and Ellie have been through up until this point. But at the end of the day, it's just a fucking giraffe that you can pet. Joel and Ellie take a moment to enjoy the view before moving on with the last stretch of their journey. Joel takes a moment to tell Ellie that she doesn't need to go through with all of this if she doesn't want to, that they could simply turn back and return to Tommy's place, attempt to live a normal life. But Ellie simply replies,
After all we've been through. Everything that I've done. It can't be for nothing.
It can't be for nothing, eh? Well, it's good you told Joel that. At least now he won't be tempted to kill dozens of innocent people to pull you out of the hospital at the last minute. The two of them are rapidly closing in on the hospital now, but before they can get there, they have one final encounter with infected to deal with. This is the biggest infected fight in the game, and one of the most challenging moments in the entire series. Not only do you have several runners and clickers to deal with, but the developers were kind enough to also throw in 2 bloaters for good measure. It's an incredible fight and puts everything you've learned up to this point to good use. Shortly after clearing the area of infected, Joel and Ellie find themselves having to carefully cross this overturned bus, which goes about as well as expected. Seeing Ellie jump back on the bus to save Joel just cemented her as one of my favourite video game characters of all time. Despite the fact that she can't swim, nothing is going to stop her from keeping Joel safe. Unfortunately, however, the bus overturns again, and Joel only has seconds to save himself and Ellie from drowning. Upon pulling Ellie from the water, he notices that she has stopped breathing and begins performing CPR on her. Before he has the chance to save her, however, he is knocked unconscious by a firefly. He awakens sometime later and is greeted by Marlene of all people. Marlene reassures Joel that everything is fine and that Ellie survived. However, Joel insists that he see her as soon as possible. Marlene then drops this bombshell on him.
Take me to her.
You don't have to worry about her anymore. We'll take care
I
of her.
worry. Just let me see her, please.
You can't. She's being prepped for surgery.
The hell do you mean, surgery?
The doctors tell me the cordyceps, the growth inside her, has somehow mutated. It's why she's immune. Once they remove it, they'll be able to reverse engineer a vaccine. A vaccine.
but it grows all over the brain.
It does.
Find someone else.
There is no one else.
Listen, you were gonna show me where...
Stop.
So it turns out that creating a vaccine to save humanity requires Ellie to sacrifice her own life. Joel understandably isn't hearing any of this. He has spent the better part of a year with Ellie. Despite not wanting to have any kind of connection with her at the beginning of the game, Joel now views Ellie as if she was his own daughter. She has saved his life on multiple occasions. She's been through the trauma of nearly being raped and eaten by cannibals. She's lost everyone she has ever loved in the most heartbreaking fashion. She's been through enough. So as far as Joel is concerned, Ellie isn't throwing her life away just so she can save the kind of scumbags who put her through all this hell in the first place. If there's one thing the player has learned while playing The Last of Us, it's that humanity is not worth saving anymore. Everywhere you look, you'll find murderers, thieves, rapists, cannibals, people who can't make sturdy fucking ladders. This world has taken everything from Ellie. Why should she have to give her life to protect it? When you approach the story from this thought process, everything Joel does from here on out makes sense. While being escorted from the premises by a guard, Joel performs one of the coolest, yet riskiest maneuvers I've ever seen in my life. I mean, how he managed to pull that off without getting his head blown off, I'll never know. Joel kills the guard before laying waste to another 24 or so of Marlene's men. This is actually my least favourite combat sequence in the game, especially on higher difficulties. It's just needlessly challenging, to the point where it can start to feel unfair at times. There's a seemingly endless amount of guards to fight through, and if you die at any point during this combat encounter, you are more than likely going to be sent back a fair distance. Still, it's the final combat arena in the game, and as such, it gets a pass despite its stupidly high difficulty level. Eventually, Joel makes it past the guards and arrives outside the operating room, where Ellie is being prepped for surgery. He busts into the room, and it is here where Joel makes a decision that a lot of people didn't and still don't agree with. He kills this doctor. Initially, I too hated Joel for doing this. I mean, why couldn't he just knock him out or something? But the more I thought about it, the more Joel's decision to kill the doctor made sense to me. Put it this way, would you consider this doctor a good person? Yes, of course. His job is to heal wounds and cure illnesses. Okay, now let me ask you this. Would you consider the soldier from the start of the game to be a good person? I mean, his job literally revolves around serving his country and protecting the people within it. Yet he guns down Joel's daughter without a second thought. When Joel meets the soldier, his first words to Sarah are, "It's okay, baby, we're safe." He trusted this soldier, and it cost Sarah her life. So Joel couldn't give a fuck whether this doctor is a good human being or not. As far as he is concerned, the doctor only exists to take Ellie away from him. The last time, he did nothing. But this time, he's got a motherfucking flamethrower. Well shit, this is kinda fucked up. Hope this doesn't come back to bite me in the ass later. I can't do a Texas accent. Joel picks Ellie up and runs towards the nearest exit. This scene mirrors the beginning of the game, which I thought was a nice touch. Upon reaching the hospital car park, however, he's stopped by Marlene. Marlene begs Joel to let Ellie go and move on with his life. She claims that this is what Ellie would have wanted, and it's easy to tell from the expression on Joel's face that he realizes she's right. Anyways, he shoots her in the face and drives off with Ellie. Upon waking up, Ellie asks Joel why she's in the backseat of a truck, still wearing her hospital gown. Joel informs Ellie that the Fireflies were unable to create a vaccine and that she's not the only immune person in the world. Dozens of immune people have been discovered all over the world, yet no one was able to successfully reverse engineer a vaccine despite this. The final scene in the game has the player take control of Ellie for one last time. At first, I didn't understand why Naughty Dog chose to make the player control Ellie instead of Joel here, but I think it's because the writers wanted us to view Joel from Ellie's perspective during this scene. Ellie loves Joel, but she also knows that he's flawed, broken, selfish, and maybe even a little pathetic. She knows that he's not being honest with her, and that's why she confronts him about it.
Back in Boston? Back when I was bitten? I wasn't alone. My best friend was there. And she got bit too. We didn't know what to do. So... she says... let's just wait it out. You know, we can be all poetic and just lose our minds together. I'm still waiting for my turn.
Ellie.
Her name was Riley, and she was the first to die. And then it was Tess. And then Sam.
None of that is on you.
You don't understand.
I struggled for a long time with surviving. And you... no matter what, you keep finding something to fight for. Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
In my opinion, this ending is pure perfection. Throughout the whole game, we've rooted for Joel, despite his violent nature. We know that deep down he's a good person. We trust him to do the right thing by Ellie, only for him to reveal his true colours at the last minute. Joel murders a whole hospital of innocent people, takes Ellie from the hospital for his own selfish reasons, completely fucks the world and everyone in it as a result, and then lies straight to Ellie's face about it afterwards. Joel is not a good person. However, we empathise with him and even forgive his selfishness, because we've been on this journey with him. We've seen him lose everything. We've seen him become a shadow of his former self, a tired, violent, bitter old man. We've seen him slowly redeem himself through his relationship with Ellie, and we've seen how happy he's become by the end of the game. Almost like he feels the universe has given him a second chance at having a daughter again. So while Joel's actions at the end of the game are unquestionably villainous, most people will at least understand why he did what he did, regardless of whether they agreed with him or not. It's an easy thing to make us empathise with the hero of a story. It's a much more difficult thing to make us empathise with the villain. And that's why The Last of Us remains the pinnacle of video game writing, in my opinion. Playing through The Last of Us again for this review, I wasn't expecting the game to still hold up so well over half a decade later, but in my opinion, the game is just as fun to play now as it was back in 2013. The Last of Us is Naughty Dog's masterpiece as far as I'm concerned. It represents one of those rare occasions where everything came together more perfectly than even Naughty Dog could have foreseen. The story, the characters, the gameplay, the music, the fucking music. Gustavo Santaolalla score for The Last of Us is up there with some of the greatest video game music ever composed. The main theme alone has been playing non-stop in my head for the last 2 weeks. The score isn't bombastic or over the top by any means, which is what you would probably expect from the soundtrack of an action-adventure game. Instead, it's reserved and occasionally haunting. Most of the game's soundtrack was composed using simple string instruments. Yet during more intense moments, the score can take on a more tribal feeling, with drums being thrown into the mix. I'm not the best at describing music, so I'm going to stop here. So that's The Last of Us. It's still one of my favourite games of all time, and I hope I was able to do the game justice in this review. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. Also, I have a Patreon if you would like to maybe help fund some of my future content. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.